Alexander Alexandrovich Fyodorov was born and raised in Chita. By the age of 40, he had already served 4 prison sentences for hooliganism, theft, and abuse. After being released once again, he couldn't stay idle for long. And in order to lure a woman to his home, he came up with a rather convincing and foolproof method. The essence of it was that Alexander carefully wrote ads about renting out an apartment and listing his work phone number, posted them on fences and poles. By fate, one of his first clients turned out to be Alexandra Kogut. She came to Chita from Krasnokamensk and studied here at the medical institute. She lived with her friends in a cramped apartment, but from the very beginning of living on her own, she wanted to have her own place. That's why she paid attention to Neborovsky's modest ad. A young officer of the Soviet army, a captain, is temporarily renting out his apartment due to relocation. Anyone interested, please call. And the girl called. "If you don't mind, I'll show you my apartment," the landlord said politely. "I can leave the furniture and dishes for you to use. But for that, an inventory is necessary so that in 2 or 3 years I can come and check my property against it." "Forgive me, I had no idea," Sasha replied. "Let's write it up right now, why waste time?" They made the inventory together and counted all the spoons, forks, glasses, in short, everything the benefactor was leaving for the girl's temporary use. Time dragged on professionally. When the clock hands relentlessly approached 12, Alexandra became anxious. "Yes, why are you in such a hurry, dear?" the host reassured her. "Now we'll enjoy some tea, discuss a few details to the end, and I'll personally walk you home. I'll pay for the taxi, you don't need to worry. Go to the bathroom to wash your hands and then come to the table." When Alexandra approached the sink, turned on the water and soaped her hands, he suddenly attacked her from behind and tightly squeezed her neck with a scarf. The girl's body convulsed and slowly began to sink to the floor. After mocking the dead woman to his satisfaction, the criminal dragged her back to the bathroom and left her there until morning. Fedorov started the new day with an unpleasant task. He took a hunting hatchet from the storage room. In early May, builders constructing a bridge on the Itinka River noticed blankets floating in the middle of the river. By the next morning, the blanket had washed up on the shore, and when the curious builders untied the bundle, they recoiled. Inside the blanket was a bloodied female torso. A few minutes later, the police arrived at the scene, and a few days after that, military signalmen, while digging a deep trench, struck a woman's head and hands with their shovels. It was by these that Sasha Kogut's friends recognized their missing neighbor in the apartment. That same evening, the police collected all the ads about apartments for rent and recorded their addresses and phone numbers. Unfortunately, there were no results. Less than a month after the incident, a young woman was found on the street in an unconscious state. The head of the Criminal Investigation Department, Police Lieutenant Colonel Anatoly Parnitsky, was struck by one important fact. The victim found on the street and the deceased Alexandra Kogut both had the same strangulation marks on their necks. They were so identical that it was easy to assume that the same criminal was responsible. Only the victim herself could shed some light on such a strange mystery. However, her condition did not allow for any questioning for a long time. But as soon as, after quite a long time, the woman regained consciousness and was able to speak, she told the police officers what had happened to her. Maria needed a place to live, so after reading an officer's advertisement somewhere, she immediately called the number provided. The landlord himself set the time and place for the meeting and specified what he would be wearing, formal attire and a hat. That same evening she met him near the movie theater. Without much hesitation, he immediately suggested viewing the apartment and took her to his place. The woman clearly remembered that the building was on Krasnaya Zvezda Street and that his apartment was on the 4th floor. In addition, the victim described from memory in detail the layout of the kitchen and the room, as well as the furniture and the arrangement in the hallway. When she had looked over the apartment and was about to leave, the Kozane politely suggested that she make an inventory of all the property and then invited her to go to the bathroom to wash her hands and sit down at the table for tea. As soon as she turned on the water and soaped her hands, she instantly felt someone's piercing gaze from behind. She turned around sharply and saw the good-natured Kozane standing in front of her, handing her a towel. She had just wet her hands again when the man threw the towel around her neck. Then the same thing happened as with Sasha Kogut. But this time, after the brutal assault, Fyodorov didn't keep the victim at his place. Thinking she was dead, he dragged her away from his house. In the morning, she was found and brought to the hospital by ambulance. From that moment, the countdown at the Chita Region Department of Internal Affairs started ticking by the second. The investigative and operational team, led by Chief of Criminal Investigation, Police Lieutenant Colonel Parnitsky, began thoroughly searching the apartment buildings on Krasnozvezdnaya Street, visiting every apartment on the 4th floors. One of the subgroups included Anatoly Parnitsky himself, as well as Senior Investigator of the Central District Prosecutor's Office Yevgeny Pleskin, Senior Prosecutor Criminalist of the Regional Prosecutor's Office and Deputy Chief of Criminal Investigation of the Central Department of Internal Affairs of Chita, Police Captain Zavyalov. After checking dozens of apartments, they called at another one late in the evening. The door was opened by a short, thin man of middle age. The investigator's eyes quickly scanned the furniture in the hallway, and it turned out to be exactly as the victim had described in her testimony. After introducing themselves and entering the apartment, they all realized they were in the home of a maniac. The members of the subgroup were stunned by the fact that there was yet another tenant in the criminal's room. If events had unfolded slightly differently, the guest who accepted the tea would have met the same fate as at least 2 prior victims. This time, the police arrived on time. Fortunately, the woman hadn't had any tea yet. Representatives of the prosecutor's office, in the presence of witnesses, searched the apartment and found Alexandra Kogut's belongings in the storage room and under the sofa her 2 legs. Upon seeing what was found, one of the witnesses fainted and the other screamed in horror. Strangely enough, the calmest person turned out to be Fedorov himself. He didn't know at the time that his second victim would survive and identify the criminal. For 3 months after his arrest, he stayed in a psychiatric hospital pretending to be insane. It didn't work. The doctors declared him completely sane. Almost a year after committing a series of heinous crimes, Alexander Fedorov stood trial. The sentence was the highest measure of punishment. The criminal had the audacity to appeal it and submit a petition for clemency. In Moscow, the Chutinsky court's verdict was understood. The petition was denied. In 1994, the sentence was carried out. On an early December morning, a passerby found a half-naked dead man in a ravine on the bank of the Serebryanka River. The cause of death was obvious. The unknown man's head looked as if it had been struck with a sledgehammer. It was not difficult for the detectives to identify the perpetrator. A bloody trail stretched from the site of the gruesome discovery to a nearby 1-story wooden house. The police officers knew the owner of the house, Zasechkin, very well as his partner, who was known among the local drinkers by the nickname Malvina. Soon the suspects were detained and gave a detailed account of what had happened. Malvina met with Dolgov at the station square in the city of Pushkin. He was already quite tipsy, and for Malvina that state was normal. They got acquainted, started talking, and decided to go to Zasechkin's place to try some homebrew. The owner wasn't in the apartment, but that didn't bother those eager for a proper rest at all. They each had a glass, turned on the television, and danced. After another round of homebrew, the gentleman started acting more straightforwardly, from Malvina's testimony. I saw that Dolgov sat down on the couch and started undressing. He said, "I'll have sex quickly and leave." I replied, "Quickly. Only animals do such things. Drink, have a drink, but don't allow yourself to act like Oleg. My partner will come soon and we'll get in trouble." As the listener has probably guessed, it was at that moment that the formidable master of the house entered. The subsequent events, if described in literary language, looked like this. Seeing his friend and a stranger in underwear sitting together on the couch, Zasechkin felt a strong emotional agitation. According to the defendant, they both rushed for the axe at the same time. However, the owner turned out to be quicker. Zasechkin's version doesn't quite match the conclusions of the forensic medical expert. The report of the physical and technical examination notes that the victim was facing away from K at the moment the bodily injuries were inflicted. Moreover, that night Malvina also sustained injuries to her arm and head. Most likely the jealous owner had more serious reasons to be offended by Malvina and her half-naked friend. But as it seems to me, these facts no longer have any serious significance. The investigation recorded the testimonies of the suspects and witnesses and attached the necessary physical evidence to the case. The items seized from Zasechkin's house were an axe, a jacket stolen from the deceased, his trousers, boots, watch, and gloves. And suddenly, the story took an unexpected turn. Zasechkin spent the winter calmly waiting in the Sergeyev Posad detention center for the investigation to conclude and the case to reach court. But with the arrival of warm spring days, he suddenly began to show inexplicable anxiety about the fate of his garden plot. "Soon hot days will begin for you," Zasechkin wrote to the relative who had agreed to look after the house of his wayward nephew. "You were planning to plant potatoes. I only give permission for the plot behind the house. The soil is better there, and it's closer to carry water. I strictly forbid touching the land in front of the house." Further in the letter, there were assurances of loyalty and love for Malvina, to whom he wants to give ownership of the plot in front of the house. The rambling message ended with completely incomprehensible threats. If the relatives do not obey and give the land for use, then he, Zasechkin, will evict them from the house with the help of the police. The relatives didn't spend much time pondering the hidden meaning of the letter, and when the fine May days arrived, they went out to plant potatoes, completely forgetting about the instructions of the master of the house. From the testimony of the witness Kazakov, on May 13th I began digging up the garden beds in front of the windows that face Yaroslavskoye highway. One of the garden beds had pieces of insulation and a roofing iron sheet. I moved them aside and kept working, but the shovel wouldn't go deep for some reason. When I dug a few more times, a human leg appeared from the ground. The day after the discovery, Zasechkin confessed to taking the life of a certain Brovkin whose body was found in the potato patch. And a little later, he will also report taking the life of Savchenko. His body was unearthed on May 15th in the same area, in the greenhouse. They kept digging, but fortunately there was no more harvest. However, Zasechkin also spoke about other lives he allegedly took. But considering the spontaneity and inconsistency of the testimony, as well as the lack of supporting evidence, the investigator for especially important cases of the Moscow Region Prosecutor's Office, Mikhail Beloturov, decided not to pursue this line of confessions. The motives for taking lives and the methods used were no different from each other. In both cases, Malvina and the owner's axe played the same role. Brovkin, as the suspect explained, had been in a close relationship with Malvina for a long time. They even lived together as a threesome in Zasechkin's house for some time. And then, after another drinking session and a quarrel, the jealous man grabbed an axe and struck Brovkin on the head. That was Zasechkin's first killing. Probably for this reason, he struck his victim not with the blunt side, but with the sharp edge of the axe, something he surely regretted later. He had to burn the curtains that got blood splatters on them, wash the clothes, and mess around with rags, wiping the floor. While he was doing this, some acquaintances who came by for household reasons accidentally caught him. "What's this? Where did all that blood come from?" "The dog was slaughtered without batting an eye," the maniac said. That night, he dragged the dog out into the yard and hurriedly buried it in the ground. The fate of Savchenko's second victim was sealed when, succumbing to Malvina's charms, he agreed to stop by her place for a visit. Zasechkin found them on the couch in the dark, quiet house, according to his testimony. "I turned on the kitchen light and entered the living room. Tatiana and Petr Savchenko were asleep on the couch. The latter woke up and punched me. I ran into the kitchen, grabbed an axe, and hit Petr on the forehead with the back of it. I brought a sack, tied it around the corpse's neck, dragged it to the greenhouse and buried it. Like with Polosin in the house, under whose windows 2 murdered people were buried." To be fair, Malvina shed a tear for Brovkin. She even circled the dates on the wall calendar to mark the 9th and 40th days for the untimely departed. I don't know if the owner shared his friend's feelings, the investigation doesn't have any information about that. But it is well known that each of the victims was, in essence, a decent person. Savchenko was positively characterized at work, and Brovkin, although he hadn't worked since 1988, was respected in the city as a calm and reasonable man. If Zhilishku allows it, then it's a common thing. Malvina is well known among Pushkin residents. A wandering forward, as one of the criminal investigation officers ironically noted. She hadn't worked since turning 18. She briefly lived with her husband in her early years, but only for 2 or 3 years. She divorced due to his drinking and lost parental rights to her son. However, you can't really blame her for anything in particular either, she's just a useless woman. Relatives, however, noted Malvina's caring attitude toward her mother. She always sent holiday greeting cards and asked about her health. Well, the listener will surely decide that Zasechkin is definitely a villain. As a villain, he possessed every imaginable negative quality. The criminal case files contain enough documents to form an idea about the personality of the maniac. 38, with secondary education. No previous convictions, divorced, has a 15-year-old son dependent on him and was described positively at his place of residence. The manager of Pushkin Trades store number 45, Mrs. Zasechkina, provided an equally positive reference for Zasechkin from his last job. Hardworking and responsible, does not shirk work, notes the attentive store manager. And one more detail, she never once saw Zasechkin with an axe in his hands. You can only envy this outstanding worker on the trade front. So, the accused, although you can't call them upstanding, are quite calm, have no criminal record and are not connected to the criminal world. Ordinary drinkers like the dozens and hundreds you find in every house, village and city. In everyday life, they're quiet, even likable and sociable. They don't look like hardened villains for whom taking a life has become a trade. So where does all this blood come from? How can such brutality and cynicism be explained? Perhaps when interacting with people like themselves, these individuals simply and easily take another's life because they treat their own lives with neglect and indifference. Degraded, drunk, living from one drink to the next. Alcohol is good when it's available. Without it, you yearn for it, your soul burning. People around you are merely props and theatrical accessories. Can you, with such a philosophy, consider those around you to be living, suffering and thinking beings? Hardly. In the upside-down world of the femme fatale Malvina, her 18-year-old son, to whom she brought nothing but suffering and humiliation, showed true nobility and humanity. In his testimony as a witness, he stated, "My mother is a stranger to me, she didn't raise me, I can't tell you anything about her, we didn't live together, I have no feelings toward her because I don't know her." Pushkinsky Othel, whose jealousy killed 3 quiet drinking companions, was unrepentant. He distorted the truth, attempted to mislead investigators, denied the obvious, and deceived his cellmates. Later, he boasted to them, saying he was the new Chikatilo. After talking to him, according to a detective who knew him, your head would ache like after bad wine. Nevertheless, Zasechkin sent repentant letters from the detention center to his beloved, asking for forgiveness for all the bad things, and reproached the investigator for being too meticulous in studying his deeds. Teller's efforts were futile. Malvina was freed from custody, and, as they say in Pushkina Bashmakov, she easily found solace or distraction with a new drinking partner. It's not hard to guess that the frivolous lady had no intention of waiting for her admirer, who had been sentenced by the court to 15 years in a high-security colony. The name of this criminal will not go down in the history of criminology. There are even more outstanding characters in the gallery of monsters and little monsters. The detectives searching for the maniac are unlikely to remember the rapist's last name today, or even the circumstances of his arrest. A man without a name, who left nothing behind on earth except a sense of disgust and sorrow. His last name is quite fitting for a bastard, Gryaznov. There was no place for him in normal life. Even the criminal world, which exists outside the law, rejected him. Even his cellmates passed judgment on him, without waiting for an investigation or trial. Nevertheless, it is necessary to talk about this tragedy, if only because it could have been the first episode in a long and bloody series. In any case, Gryaznov started out just like Chikatilo, by taking the life of a little girl. Like his predecessor from Rostov, he had a clear inclination to interact with children, and he was bold and cunning. It is enough to mention the bottle with someone else's fingerprints that Gryaznov deliberately planted at the crime scene, sending the investigation down a false trail. He changed his appearance, dyed his hair a clownish red color, got a haircut, and left clean for another city. But the tricks didn't help, the search ended successfully. The beginning of August in Klin near Moscow was hot and dry. The boys kept running to the cornfield. Ripe ears of corn with neat, even rows of yellow kernels became both a treat and toys for the children. That day, the boys brought back a whole bag of corn, warm from the sun, plump and beautiful. Seeing this, 6th grader Vera, along with her friends, 13-year-old Lucy and 11-year-old Zoe, decided to go to the field. The boys' haul looked really tempting. While they were getting ready, first Zoe ran to get some bread, then they waited for their grandmother to get permission. Evening arrived. Vera and her friends finally started their journey. They rode 2 stops on the bus, got off near the reinforced concrete factory, and headed toward the village of Polukanovo. They descended a small hill near the railroad crossing and entered a cornfield. The tall stalks blocked everything around, and the leaves swayed and rustled softly in the wind. The girls quickly picked some ripe ears of corn and were about to head back when a man came toward them from the dirt road. There was something about his movements, his facial expression, and his voice that immediately made the girls feel scared and uneasy. But he acted deliberately and calmly, from the testimony of Vera Kay. We filled 2 bags, found a spot to sit, and husked the corn to eat on the go. Suddenly, a man called out to us. He said he worked for the police and was guarding the field, then added, "Who gave you permission to steal the corn?" Katya and I have nothing to eat. He grabbed my arm. "Let's go to the police." But I broke free and walked toward the road. Lyusia jumped up and followed me. The man grabbed Zoya's shoulder, ignoring her pleas to let go and her concern about her grandmother worrying. Frightened, we quickened our pace, with the man and Zoya trailing behind. Suddenly he halted, bending down as if to remove a stone from his shoe. We walked ahead as the man and Zoya fell behind, walking deeper into the field. We never saw them again. Taking the child away is an emergency in itself. In front of 2 friends, in broad daylight in August, around 6 post-meridium near the factory gate, the criminal's boldness and cold-bloodedness was shocking. No one doubted that a crime had been committed. 11-year-old Zoya had disappeared. Could the tragedy have been prevented? Probably if the girls had screamed, resisted, or defended themselves, the man would have gotten scared. The friends could have turned to the workers at the crossing they hurried past on their way home, but they didn't do it. They were afraid of the man from the police. And even after returning, they didn't rush to Zoya's family or raise the alarm. The child's disappearance became known only around 8 in the evening when the grandmother, after searching everywhere, ran to the neighbors. I'm not saying this to blame Zoya's friends or to give her family a reason to accuse anyone of the misfortune. No one is to blame for what happened except the criminal himself. Well, if the frightened friends had told the adults about everything right away, they would have found the maniac sooner and caught him with less effort. The search for the child began in the evening. They called in a search dog and started combing the cornfield. They created a verbal description of the suspect while the trail was still fresh. Hundreds of people joined the search. 300 military personnel, about 100 police officers, and 12 service dogs. They moved in a line 1 meter apart from each other but found nothing. They repeatedly searched the area. They hurriedly harvested the corn with a combine and searched once more. The commander of the Meshkovsky Joint Aviation Squadron assigned a Me-2 helicopter for the search operations. Colleagues from Petrovka 38 provided the regional police with a new American Bell 206 helicopter to assist in the search. The helicopters with search teams circled over the field and its surroundings for several days. Via radio, the pilots guided ground personnel to suspicious sites. As luck would have it, from that fateful day, heavy autumn rains began to pour, the field turned to mud, and if there were any traces of the crime or evidence left, they were completely washed away by the water. The detectives didn't stop working. The theory of child abduction was considered. Wanted posters were made with the suspect's image and a detailed description of distinguishing features. Police officers traveled through villages and settlements, questioning children in schools and boarding schools as well as passengers on commuter trains and buses. Zoya's friends were taken to Moscow, where a new, more advanced composite sketch was made. People with mental disorders, previously convicted homeless individuals, and vagrants were checked for involvement in the incident. There was still a faint hope that the girl was alive and would be found. Unfortunately, 2 weeks later, the tragedy took a new turn. A dead child's body was found in a ditch by a field. The Department of Internal Affairs of the Klin district appealed to residents to provide any possible assistance in identifying the criminal. A large reward was promised. 2 men with a tendency towards sexual perversion were identified, but both turned out to be unrelated to the incident. Days went by, hundreds of inquiries, dozens of kilometers walked by detectives around the area, and ongoing investigative operations. Sometimes it seemed like the case was about to move forward, but after checking another suspect, it became clear that the maniac was still at large. Since the crime was committed, the work had been ongoing. Despite over 6 months passing since the tragedy, the rapist was eventually apprehended. Detective Alexander Belyakov from the Klinsky District Police Department recounts the story. It began with school vandalism by misbehaving boys. The principal, our longtime professional acquaintance, requested assistance. He asked them to come and talk sense into the troublemakers. We started talking to the teenagers. From them, we learned about a group of kids who were systematically stealing things. We called them in, carefully probed to find out what's happening, and uncover an interesting detail. They give the stolen things to some adult. In the boy's eyes, he's a figure who doesn't work anywhere, lives in a basement, likes fortune-telling and horoscopes, and considers himself a clairvoyant. Who is he? Turns out he's a well-known person. He was detained for vagrancy in Klin, and now he's gone to Zelenograd. We decide to check the information. Detectives Oleg Kulikov and Andrei Mamayev go to Zelenograd. They find the suspect in a similar basement. He has items from the thefts we know about. But that's not even the main thing. Among Gryaznov's belongings, some very strange photographs were found. The pictures show children's jeans, underwear, photos of the man himself naked, and a large number of portraits of boys and girls. He took the photos simply because he wanted to. The individual item pictures were coincidental test shots, he says. It was hard to believe in such coincidences. Especially since it soon turned out that Gryaznov was involved with the boys in activities that were directly related to articles of the criminal code. To one of his acquaintances, 15-year-old N, he even sent love letters. By the way, N was living in the village of Polukhanovo at the time the girl lost her life. And on that August day, Gryaznov was looking to meet his friend. Was he involved in the serious crime? Although Gryaznov has 3 convictions, 2 for theft and 1 for vagrancy and begging, he did not resemble the composite sketch. The girl spoke about a tall, long-haired man, but this one was thin, gaunt, red-haired with a short haircut and something dirty under his nose like a mustache. It turned out he had cut his hair and dyed it. Why? Is he trying to throw us off track again? He claimed to be creative, saying such incidents occur with him. He openly discussed his talents and even offered to help find the criminal. This task is perfect for an astrologer, however we didn't assign it to him. Soon it became completely clear to us that Gryaznov had committed the murder himself. The investigators acted cautiously, slowly approaching the main event, the identification of the suspect by Zoya's friends. To begin with, they suggested that the astrologer help find the crime scene. He quickly and accurately led the investigative team to the cornfield. They then verified his testimony unusually by videotaping classmates, girlfriends, and the girls themselves. They showed the suspect the video recording. Without hesitation, he immediately pointed out both witnesses. Finally, the critical moment, the girls identifying the suspect. What if they don't recognize him? After all, Gryaznov's appearance has changed and a lot of time has passed. The girls immediately dispelled any doubts and pointed to the criminal without hesitation. After that, even the most cautious and skeptical people had no questions about the legitimacy of the accusations. I saw Gryaznov 2 weeks after his arrest. The shabby walls of the Klin detention center cell where the conversation took place matched the appearance of the criminal. It's clear that the conditions in the detention center are different from the service of a luxury hotel, but I think that's not the point. It's about people like Gryaznov that they say God marks the rogue. Fidgety, with shifty eyes and twitching limbs when he spoke, always with a hunted, pitiful expression on his face. That's how I saw the astrologer. He complained about being humiliated by his cellmates, feeling unwell and having headaches, but to be honest, he didn't stir the slightest bit of sympathy in me. He neither denied nor confirmed the fact of taking a life. Everything's bad, I remember, bar Matalon avoiding my gaze, the corn girl, and then suddenly there was a blinding sensation, noise in my head. I came to, and she wasn't breathing anymore. I got scared and ran away. The forensic expert determined that the child died from asphyxiation, meaning she was strangled. The pervert didn't assault the girl. The doctor recorded injuries to her genitals, which were most likely caused by hands. How can we not remember Chikatilo here, who compensated for his own sexual inadequacy with cannibalistic manipulations of his victims' genitals? The Gryaznov case also brought to mind another maniac. Among his belongings, amateur photos of teenagers of an explicit nature were found. The criminal said that looking at such photos gives him energy to enter the astral plane. Sadist Slivka, who dismembered young pioneers on camera, explained his actions in a similar way. He recorded the children's agony so that he could return to those sweet moments again and again. Gryaznov also asked to be given his favorite books, a volume of Diplomacy by Ludovic and the Interpreter of Dreams. You see, he has interesting dreams and wants to interpret them. Days later, I heard the official version: Gryaznov was found hanging in the morning. The criminal didn't wait for the harsh verdict of the court and took his own life. Such an ending to the story suited everyone. But what really happened? Is it possible? In the cramped cell, where inmates sometimes have to sleep in shifts due to overcrowding, there's insufficient space on the bunks. Without anyone noticing, to twist together scraps of cloth into something like a rope, make a noose, and tie it to a sturdy crossbar. Let's say you manage to do that, but how do you keep the choking sounds and convulsions secret from those around you? Even a person with iron willpower won't be able to quietly pass away. No one is able to control their own agony. So, the cellmates saw both the preparations and the execution. Isn't it easier to assume that Gryaznov's cellmates passed the sentence? It's well known how the criminal world treats molesters, rapists, and perverts. Such inmates become passive, they're degraded, raped by the whole cell, turned into hunted, broken beings who have lost all human dignity. Neither personal strength nor the prison authorities can save them from this. In the cells behind barbed wire, there are their own laws and their own justice. By the way, speaking of justice, it's unlikely that Gryaznov would have faced the ultimate punishment. It would have been more logical to expect a 15-year prison sentence. That means after 8 to 10 years of good behavior, which is typical for that category of inmates, a transfer to a settlement or even amnesty wouldn't be out of the question. Those who are familiar with legal statistics know how realistic such prospects are. If anyone knows this well, it's the inmates. That's why many rapists, especially those who abuse children, don't make it to trial. Their sentence is delivered right in the cell. That's how the leader of the Kashira gang, Smayan, the maniac and lawless man from Lyubertsy, Kryuchkov, and the child molester from Solnekhnogorsk, Chernik, ended their lives. A detective I know from the Moscow Criminal Investigation Department told me how they miraculously managed to save a detainee in Moscow who was arrested for a series of attacks on children, a pervert, from his cellmates in Matroskaya Tishina. First, they thoroughly abused him, giving free rein to their forced abstinence and their own imagination, and then they handed him a piece of razor blade. You have until dawn. The duty officer on the floor happened to notice the detainee, who was bleeding on the floor, when he looked through the cell peephole. They revived him in the prison infirmary and transferred him to another cell, but it's unlikely this will change his fate. The ghost of Chikatilo, whom some details of Gryaznov's crime reminded people of, appeared in that same 1993 in another Moscow region city, Pushkino. Although it's absurd to compare the local maniac to the Rostov monster. The audacity and cold-bloodedness with which he sent people to the next world brought him notoriety and a respectful attitude from his neighbors in the detention center. The man sat heavily, leaning on the table. He didn't hear the front door slam, nor did he see a man appear in the doorway, not standing very steadily on his feet. So you showed up, you parasite. Weren't you afraid? Well, that's fine. Soon you won't be afraid of anything at all, thought the man who entered, and carefully, so as not to startle him, backed out into the hallway. Standing on tiptoe, he rummaged through the mezzanine shelves, taking the same precautions not to clatter or make any noise. He took out a sharply honed axe from there, gripped it tightly with both hands, approached the man who still hadn't sensed his final hour, and with a sudden, forceful swing, brought the axe down on the seated man's neck. Looking at the work of his hands, the man who had taken a life grunted with satisfaction, carefully leaned the axe against the wall, and left the apartment. Hey Grigorich, so I chopped him up, he calmly told his neighbor. Chopped up who? Where? What are you talking about, Ivanich? Do you need to sober up? I chopped up my son, Alexander, the criminal calmly replied, and once again his eyes flashed with hatred. I warned him. He should have listened to his father. By the age of 55, Vladimir Ivanovich Bartashevich held the position of engineer-economist at one of the capital's enterprises. He had a reputation as a difficult person, not due to his large bear-like figure, but his character. However, Vladimir Ivanovich himself didn't consider himself difficult, what an idea, but rather principled. His principles were as straight as rails. To arrive and leave work on time, to speak actively at party and professional meetings, to shame idlers, drunkards and truants, to support and implement the policies of the party and the government. To keep his wife and son in order and discipline so that every spoon and every item in the apartment was in the place strictly designated by Vladimir Ivanovich. To have a drink on holidays with friends and neighbors, but in moderation, with good snacks and pleasant conversation. However, I didn't notice Bartashevich that more and more often he began to play the leading role in these conversations. The neighbors and drinking companions, inwardly wincing, were forced to humbly listen to the clever speeches of their scholarly neighbor. No, that parasite Gorbati should be hanged on the first branch and a stake driven into him. That bastard sold the country to the capitalists, ruined everything, but built himself a mansion in Switzerland. Soon they'll buy all of us out and we'll be working for pennies under their rubber baton, Bartashevich was ranting once again. As if you didn't work for pennies under the communists too. 140 a month, a 10 ruble bonus and an honorary certificate. And you were afraid to say a word against the bosses, once you dared to express your opinion. Son Alexander, you're just a pup, don't mess with us. We knew what we were working for. We could endure it so that you fools could have a better life. That's when you did your part. There's so much good stuff around, you don't even know what to do with it. The son demonstratively gestured around the more than modest setting of a typical standard apartment. Get out of my house, you brat, the offended father roared. Keep in mind, you scoundrel, if you keep mouthing off and don't come to your senses, I'll ruin you with my own hands. After such family dialogues, Alexander, seeing real hatred in his father's eyes, would quickly leave the house. The neighbors, who were often witnesses to such dialogues, would shrug their shoulders in bewilderment. Why was Ivanchik picking on his son? He's just a regular guy, not a criminal or troublemaker, never rude, earns his own living and doesn't want to burden his parents. And as for the fact that he treats his father's nostalgia for the good old happy times with a fair amount of irony, well, let him. Not everything was so beautiful and radiant in the past. Let Vladimir Bartashevich peacefully indulge in the memories dear to his heart, denouncing all sorts of Democrats. How many people at the end of the Soviet Union believed that Pepsi Cola was a drink invented by the CIA specifically to corrupt Soviet youth? That today he plays jazz and tomorrow he'll betray his motherland? If his total dissatisfaction with today's reality hadn't somehow become personified in his mind as one person, whom he saw as the cause of all today's troubles. That person turned out to be his own son. It was in him, an ordinary guy, that Bartashevich saw all the evil and all the vices of today's life concentrated. The father was infuriated by his son's independence, his independent thinking, and the fact that his advice and guidance, mostly far removed from the realities of the day, were listened to by his son with a smirk. Such rather blatant insubordination, something Bartashevich had almost never encountered before in his life, drove him to a white heat, making him gasp with rage. And then something terrible happened. After one of the arguments with his son, when the boy slammed the door and left, Bartashevich went to the store and bought an axe specifically to chop off his son's head. Hey there neighbors, just sitting around doing nothing, shooting the breeze. On a hot June day, Bartashevich approached Medvedev and Kryukov, who were resting on a bench. We're just sitting here, what else is there to do, they said. A sitting backside gets no water, especially since nothing stronger is flowing. Bartashevich was in a good mood and was joking with his neighbors. You could have chipped in, bought some booze and had a sit together. Medvedev, knowing how gatherings with Bartashevich usually end. He was about to refuse, but Kryukov, a quiet and calm man who would patiently listen to Bartashevich's lengthy musings and whom Bartashevich favored for that, unexpectedly supported the idea. Soon, all three of them, having stocked up at the nearest grocery store with St. John's wort and polevaya, settled in Bartashevich's kitchen. Soon everything went just as Medvedev had foreseen. While they were having the first shots and snacking on simple food, it was quiet and calm, not the time for conversation. Later, when the alcohol spread its blessed warmth through their bodies and the feeling of hunger dulled, Bartashevich got back on his favorite topic again. He started harshly criticizing the Democrats, speculators and other freeloaders. Come on, let's have one more drink before calling it a night. Medvedev somehow managed to interrupt Bartashevich's rant. Let's stand outside for a bit and get some fresh air. The apartment owner, though displeased, agreed with his neighbor. The friends finished the drinks and went down to the entrance. Hey, Igor, come here, Bartashevich suddenly called out to a passing boy. Hello, Vladimir Ivanovich? The boy stopped. If you see Alexander today, tell him not to come home. Otherwise I'll cut off his head. Bartashevich exhaled heavily into the boy's face. Whoa, psycho, that frozen guy has totally lost it. Yeah, right, like, I'll really tell Sasha all that and try to scare him, thought the boy, and hurried away from Bartashevich as quickly as possible. Listen, Ivanich, why are you picking on the kid? He's an adult, he has his own life. Do you really think you'll be raising him until he turns grey? I tried to cool down Bartashevich's temper. Medvedev, it's none of your business. I brought that scoundrel into this world and I'll be the one to ruin him, he roared. And when he saw that his friend and attentive listener Kryukov had disappeared somewhere, he started to sway. A considerable amount of alcohol clouded his eyes as he went up to his apartment. There, seeing a man sitting at the table, he instantly became enraged, not afraid at all, thinking, "So, you showed up," and sneaking climbed up to the mezzanine. And before you find out what happens next, like this video, subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss new strange and scary stories. Also, subscribe to the Strashnody Telegram channel. The format, content and atmosphere are completely different and unique. Entry is forbidden for the faint-hearted, but if you're not afraid, the link is below the video. Alexander killed his own son with an axe. Bartashevich kept repeating to the shocked neighbors, "Come, see what's left of this parasite." When the neighbors, stunned by the terrible news, went up to Bartashevich's apartment, they saw something that deprived them of peace of mind for a long time. On the kitchen table, covered in blood with his head half severed and lifeless, lay not Bartashevich's son Alexander, but their neighbor, Bartashevich's best friend Kryukov. As the investigation later found out, the poor fellow went up to his friend's apartment and dozed off in the kitchen. Bartashevich, in a drunken frenzy, mistook him for his son and decided to immediately carry out his wild threats. A thick, battered notebook lay in front of the investigator. One might think it had survived since the beginning of the 20th century. Some of the pages had yellowed, and there was a large, greasy stain on the cover. The man pulled it closer to himself, opened the first page, nothing. On the second page, a phrase was written in crooked handwriting and clearly in a hurry because it was almost impossible to make out what it said. The investigator saw no point in focusing on the following pages. They remained untouched. In the middle of the notebook was probably the most important long table, with 7 columns and 27 rows. Such a table is drawn in history lessons to visually represent events of a huge scale. Particular interest was sparked by the letters filling the third column, uppercase P, lowercase p, uppercase n. In the next column there were also letters, R, alternating with T. The man pensively wiped his sweaty brow, pondering the meaning of it all. Later, during the interrogation, the arrested Vadim Yershov, to whom this mysterious diary belonged, explained with an impassive face. A capital P means he finished someone off with a knife, a capital N means the knife was a kitchen knife, and a lowercase p means he beat someone to death with his hands or a stick. Well, as for R and T, that's simple. R stands for wound, T stands for corpse. Krasnoyarsky, Chikatilo carefully recorded all the details of his crimes in this notebook. In the first column, he proudly wrote the victim's serial number. In the second, he indicated the season when the attack was committed. In the third, he recorded the methods or weapons used for killing. In the fourth, the nature of the injury. And in the fifth, he noted the victim's gender. The last columns contained equally important information about the crimes, where and in what year they were committed. Almost 3 dozen names, 3 dozen fates, most of which were irretrievably ruined. And all this is on the conscience of one person, or rather, not a person, but a beast. That's exactly what they called Vadim Yershov. The first line in the Maniac's bloody record dates back to 1991. The Far East, cold walls, barracks, all dispersed to their quarters. Only 18-year-old Yershov is standing, leaning against the wall, listening closely. There he is, his offender, one of those who bully the newcomers. He comes out of the sleeping quarters and walks down the narrow corridor with a sly grin. The brick in Yershov's hand has already become hot from the rising tension. After a few moments, he attacks the colleague Yershov despises. The last drops of resentment were on the tip of the knife. Its blade finished the job. The colleague was seriously injured but survived. After this incident, no one in the army dared to bully the previously downtrodden Yershov anymore. Soon after, he deserted altogether. In the second row of the table, the age of the victim stood out, 16 years old. Spring on the Yenisei river's bank, the bird's song and quiet petal rustling are interrupted by measured footsteps. Ahead there's a lightness, a pause at the delicate heels. It's a young student from the local vocational school. Behind her are the heavier, duller footsteps of a man in rough men's boots. This is Vadim Yershov. He attacks the girl from behind, drags her into the nearest bushes and assaults her. Shocked, frightened and dishonored, the girl survives. In this, she is lucky. But the third line of the crime chart is already chilling. Instead of the letter R, it now shows a T. The first body is on Yershov's record. June 28, 1992, the outskirts of a Krasnoyarsk public catering establishment. One of his employees, a 42-year-old woman. The workday has come to an end and she is heading home with her colleagues. Halfway home, they part ways, each heading toward their own house. It is this woman whom the beast attacks. In his bloodshot eyes there is lust, anger, and power. Yershov catches up with the victim and commits an act of assault despite the possibility of witnesses nearby. After what he has done, he beats this woman with a stick, hitting her without noticing anyone or anything. The result of this brutal attack is inevitably the death of the unfortunate woman. The murderer doesn't try to hide the dead body, he just covers it with a mesh of thin, dry branches. Then, in the ill-fated notebook, various names, places, and dates of book follow one after another. There are already much more than there were at the beginning. Impunity only fueled Yershov's desire. His table is still missing 40 rows that should contain information about the robberies committed by the maniac. One day, even a police officer who tried to detain him was injured. Yershov didn't pay attention to passers-by, choosing a certain type of appearance, age, or gender. He hunted young and elderly women, men and children. Often his goal was to steal something. Handbags, jewelry, especially wallets, all of this, after the brutal attack on his victims, became the property of the maniac. Reviewing all these numbers, letters, words, and entire phrases, the police officers were horrified. One of the victims listed in the table was 13-year-old Anya Voronina. They had known this girl's story for a long time. She was hit several times with a stick and then stabbed with a knife until she died. There were also signs of abuse. The thing is, for the crime committed against Anya, a completely different person had previously been arrested, a 17-year-old guy named Igor who went to the same school as her. It turned out to be unfair. After the scandal broke out, Igor was released from the detention center and his parents received 14 million rubles as compensation. Several police officers were punished for such an unforgivable mistake. Besides Anya Voronina's case, there were two more in which other men were listed as the alleged perpetrators. The table, whose contents send shivers down your spine, is missing one more row, the very last one. In it, the following should be noted: October 29, 1995, the entrance of a residential building in Krasnoyarsk. A 16-year-old girl is returning home. A suspicious man follows her up the stairs, clearly a stranger. Maybe he's going to visit someone, but for some reason he focuses his attention on the young college student. Suddenly, he attacks her from behind and grabbing her by the neck tries to take off her gold chain. The girl resists, screams, tries to push the attacker away with her hands. Her cries for help can be heard even at the door of her own apartment. Fortunately, two men appear on the landing of the upper floor and, sensing something is wrong, head straight toward Yershov. He fights them off with a knife. A resident of the apartment next to the victims also hears the screams. She rushes to help with a fire extinguisher in her hand. One blow, Yershov, who didn't react to the threat in time, is already lying face down at the feet of the brave woman. According to another version, the tragic outcome that could have resulted from this sudden attack on the girl was prevented by her relatives. Whatever the details of what happened, the main thing is that everything turned out well. At this point, it's time to write the long-awaited "The End" under the table. It was on that autumn day that the police managed to catch the maniac who had been terrorizing Krasnoyarsk for so many years by surprise, and brought him to the Zheleznodorozhny District Police Department. The detainee refused to give testimony, made up a surname, and in the end claimed that he was just a homeless man wandering aimlessly around the city. Later, he finally broke down, and that's when it became clear where he actually lived. In Yershov's apartment, the tools of the crime were found, among which two knives stood out. Oddly enough, the detainee himself called them feathers, as well as passports and the victim's belongings, a worn jacket and boots. The maniac admitted with thinly veiled delight that he always sought out media coverage about himself after each attack, reading newspapers and watching television. Afterwards, he would go to the crime scene from a distance, as if trying on the role of an ordinary eyewitness. He watched as the investigators worked tirelessly, sweating to find at least some evidence. After Ershov was arrested, some facts from his biography came to light. Vadim was born on February 15, 1973 in the village of Reknoy, located in the Kirov region. The boy's father suffered from schizophrenia. His mother did not have any mental disorders, but apparently there were some peculiarities in her behavior. Taking her younger daughter with her, she left home, leaving Vadim in the care of his sick father, who soon committed suicide. After that, the younger Ershov was reunited with his mother and sister, and they moved to the village of Primorsk. There he finished high school. The teachers spoke very positively about the boy. They valued his gentle, calm nature, and were truly impressed by the literary talent that Vadim displayed. He wrote essays brilliantly, loved to philosophize, and created entire analytical texts on various topics. However, by the time Ershov finished school, some troubling signs began to appear in his behavior. He started to abuse animals and commit arson. That's almost the McDonald triad, which helps identify particularly dangerous criminals by certain behavioral traits in adolescence. Ershov is indeed an extremely dangerous criminal, as evidenced by the brutality of his crimes. One of the investigators directly involved in his case recalled, "I got the impression that he took lives to cover up the traces of his crimes, assaults and robberies. He was washing dishes as if his beastly animalistic crimes meant nothing." In addition, as he grew older, Ershov experienced many failures in his relationships with women. Actually, there were no relationships at all. Girls didn't pay any attention to him. He was self-conscious about his short height, withdrew into himself instead of actually trying to connect with his female classmates. He treated them with aggression, which often led to him being punished by their boyfriends. In the summer of 1998, the Siberian District Military Court found Ershov guilty on all counts of the charges brought against him for the crimes and attempted crimes he committed. A grim verdict was delivered, the death penalty. Upon hearing those terrifying words, Ershov fainted right in the courtroom. Despite a brief report from the Center for Forensic Psychiatry stating that the maniac suffered from total psychosexual developmental delay and had an abnormal urge to commit murders, he was still found sane. Not even the appeal filed by Ershov's lawyer could soften the court's decision. But fortune still smiled on the Krasnoyarsk Chikatilo thanks to the moratorium on the death penalty. Instead of execution, Ershov received a life sentence and to this day spends his days in the Black Dolphin colony in the Orenburg region. He called on May 29, 1994 on a Sunday, introduced himself as Lesha and invited her to the Lesha video salon. Sveta didn't understand right away, but yes, it was the guy she met last week. But why? He's asking what I look like and what I'll be wearing? Did he forget or something? A skirt, a windbreaker, just like last time. We agreed to meet at 20 near the new circus, and Sveta walked from the river station to the university across the whole city in the drizzling rain, without telling anyone about the upcoming date. Instead of the young man in a denim suit whom she expected to see, a young but already balding man of about 30 approached, wearing long unironed trousers and a corduroy jacket. He had an umbrella in his hand and a pocket knife keychain on his belt. The backstory of the impromptu rendezvous turned out to be simple. 5 years ago, on a bus, he met two girls, got Svetka's phone number from her friend, and now, stumbling upon it in his notebook 5 years later, he called her. When they met, she wasn't attracted to the man, as they used to say. However, this didn't influence her choice. She came all this way to see a movie, no matter what. When they took the bus to the apartment building in Fili and went up to the apartment door, Sveta was initially surprised. There was no such agreement, but it wasn't the first time she'd been in the company of casual acquaintances, and nothing bad had ever come of it. After a brief hesitation, she entered the long, dark hallway. The host cautioned, "Don't make any noise. Wake up the sick old woman in the next room." He sat her by the videocassette recorder and asked while rummaging through the tapes. Erotica, action movies, detective stories. Sveta liked horror films. He put on the sci-fi thriller The Creature in the Basket. That's how the evening video session began, which turned into a 6-month nightmare. The movie reached the halfway point. Suddenly, strong arms grabbed her from behind. A large dagger flashed before her eyes and painfully pressed against her neck. "Take off your clothes." She came to in the bathroom, completely naked and tied hand and foot with thin nylon twine. How long had she been lying here? A day, a week, a month? Vague memories crowded her mind. Here, the new acquaintance makes her swallow a handful of white and green birth control pills, explaining briefly. Now he's holding a syringe, then he's right above her, naked as the day he was born, and now animal-like his heavy breathing is right by her face. Sveta didn't feel any pain, disgust, or fear. Maybe it was the tranquilizers her attacker had given her, or maybe her internal safety mechanism had burned out, protecting her body from self-destruction. Sexual acts became a mandatory part of their daily interactions. At 19, Sveta wasn't a prude, but until now no one had dared to do anything to her that she didn't want. Sometimes he punished her for making accidental noise or for asking silly questions like, "Why are you keeping me here?" He would hit her hard in the chest, deprive her of the meager meal that served as breakfast, lunch and dinner and consisted of thin soup brought by the old woman. She worked at the hospital and wasn't bedridden with illness in the back room at all. The owner wouldn't let anyone pass the threshold, so the pot of food was left with the neighbors. Alexei's version of the imprisonment went like this. Some of Sveta's friends lost big at cards and their partners gave them an ultimatum, either the money or someone's life. For example, Sveta's Alexei. In this way, he played the role of a noble savior who protected the girl from inevitable retribution. The hostage, of course, didn't believe a single word, although she didn't try to escape either. The bonds were too strong. A sturdy stick was propping up the bathroom door, and it was impossible to flood the neighbors downstairs to let them know she was there. Careful Lesha had unscrewed all the valves from the faucets. There was no point in shouting either. The radio, which was blasting at full volume whenever the owner was away, drowned out any other sounds. And the daily routine of this strange, frightening man was anything but varied. All night he would sit by the television or listen to music. The expensive imported equipment stood in stark contrast to the shabby condition of the apartment, which was cluttered with junk and covered in a thick layer of dust. He would go to bed at dawn, and for the captive, a brief and restless period of respite would begin. By noon, unable to bear the silence and the cold, it was already autumn, and the two skimpy rags thrown at the bottom of the bathtub offered no protection. She seriously considered suicide. The rope on her wrists had loosened. This was done so that Sveta could scoop soup from behind her back herself with a special curved spoon, which with some skill could easily serve as a noose. But the captive still didn't dare take the final step, even though her strength to endure was running out. And then she resorted to the practice of transmitting thoughts over a distance. Alyosha sometimes ordered her to dictate the teachings on telepathy onto a tape recorder, a stack of typewritten pages lying on a chair so that he could later listen to the recording in solitude. As Sveta noted, he generally had a soft spot for all sorts of mysticism and the occult. "Well, wake up already," she kept repeating mentally with the persistence of a machine, and the tormentor really did wake up. But it's better to have some kind of action, even if it's disgusting and humiliating, than the chills of an exhausted naked body and the oppressive gloom of a cramped room. When there wasn't enough of their usual food for the two of them, he would go down to the yard to hunt, shooting sparrows, pigeons and crows with his air rifle. Once he even brought back a dead wagtail. After cooking, the tiny bits of meat went to the hunter. The girl had to make do with bones and scraps. Sometimes, though, she got some rotten apples or wormy potatoes. Once he dug out an old wool sweater, moth-eaten, from a pile of rags and made her pick off and eat the insect larvae. When she asked in confusion why, he explained with an expert look, "Vitamins." Svetlana's rare entertainment was giving massages, which Alexei loved while watching television. Then he would lead her into the room with a blindfold on, sit down on the floor and laugh obnoxiously, especially if they were showing KVN. By that time she had learned to pick a thinner fabric, so they watched television together. At the end of November, Lesha announced something she had long stopped dreaming about. "I'll let you go home, but first you'll write a note saying you owe me $7,900. Come up with an excuse for your absence, such as falling in love with someone and living with them for a while. If you go to the police, I'll kill your whole family." "Thank you," was all the girl could reply, knowing how much importance he placed on being addressed politely. Standing at the bus stop in some unimaginable rags and heavy man's boots worn barefoot. He sold the hostage's clothes. Sveta requested a subway token. "Go up to the ticket inspector, say you're unemployed and they'll let you through," the benefactor advised. And suddenly in a completely different tone, "So I taught you to love freedom." Sveta just nodded in time with the last words of advice. "Do you want me to be your older brother?" he said. "You'll invite me over and cook chicken, sauerkraut, and definitely a chocolate pie." A surreal dream. At home they didn't recognize her due to their long wait. Her own uncle mistook her for a vagabond, her beloved dog Rem rushed at her feet in fury and then kept his distance. For 2 days Sveta was no longer her lively self. Her hair fell out in clumps and her legs were unresponsive for an extended period. In 26 hungry weeks, she lost so much weight that her friend of the same age could easily carry her up 3 whole flights of stairs. Sveta eventually went to the police and they found Lesha. However, it turned out he wasn't Lesha at all, but Oleg, a 28-year-old man who had once been registered with a diagnosis of schizophrenia. His relatives had long stopped getting involved in his affairs. He only met with his parents at their country house and was unemployed. He barely managed with occasional income as a street vendor. Investigators discovered strangers' belongings in his home. The woman suspected that the victim might not be the first hostage of the sexual maniac. During the identification at the police department, a few days before being sent to Butyrka, Lesha Oleg asked hopelessly, "What do you want?" And she coldly replied, "I want you to feel what I felt, but it's better if you just don't exist. At all." In July 1992, a 40-year-old resident of the village of Dvortsy was returning home. The way was long, so to shorten it, she turned onto a quiet forest path. Suddenly, a man emerged from the bushes right in front of her. One might have thought he would go his own way, but instead the stranger rushed at the woman and held a knife to her throat. The supposed victim turned out to be quite clever. Gaining the trust of the aggressive passerby, who clearly intended to commit indecent acts, she promised to quench his thirst, but chose a way that was more advantageous for herself. To explain her actions, the lady referred to a problem of a purely feminine nature that was bothering her. Simply put, she said she was on her period and agreed to satisfy the man orally. That was acceptable to her companion. Anticipating pleasure, he pulled down his pants, but then suddenly cried out in terrible pain. The woman bit him as hard as she could in his private area. Soon she hurried to leave the ill-fated path, leaving the troubled victim writhing on the ground from the sudden physical torment. After escaping, the woman ran into workers from a nearby collective farm and pleaded with them for help. "Help me, someone tried to assault me." "Maybe that's the maniac everyone is talking about," she said with desperation in her voice. The workers immediately contacted the proper authorities, and the police officers, responding to the report, created a plan to catch the suspicious individual. The victim also decided not to sit idly by and enthusiastically shared the duties of the law enforcement officers. Amazingly, at some point she managed to recognize in the man limping on one leg who was walking along the railroad tracks her recent offender. "There he is! Catch him!" she cried out, instinctively pressing her hand to her heart. The detainee behaved calmly and showed no signs of concern. After checking his documents, the law enforcement officers even began to doubt that he could have committed any crime if, once again, the indignant woman had not intervened in the process. "Take off his pants, I bit him so hard he'll remember it for the rest of his life." The suspect complied, though a bit reluctantly, and soon it became clear why. There was a nearly fresh bite mark on his genitals. After such compelling evidence, any doubts about the man's guilt immediately vanished. He was arrested. The offender of the resourceful lady turned out to be a 30-year-old resident of the city of Smolensk, Artur Kimovich Kitaev. After Artur Kitaev's arrest, his entire criminal past came to light, sometimes filled with blood-curdling facts. The future maniac was born in 1962 in the city of Krasnokamsk. He had a younger brother named Konstantin. Very little is known about Kitaev's early life. However, there is information that despite his developed communication skills and far from primitive thinking, he already showed cruelty in his youth. After reaching adulthood, he put this trait into action through specific crimes involving physical violence, for which he received his first prison sentence. After his release, there was no change in Kitaev's mindset. With the same initiative, he resumed the criminal activity he had grown to enjoy, but this time he also recruited his brother. Together they committed several thefts. Although the role of robbers helped the criminal satisfy his material needs, his disregard for the law once again landed him behind bars. He was sentenced to 9 years and sent to a general regime colony. In 1990, Artur Kitaev successfully managed to escape and made his way to Perm, where his parents lived. There he visited an acquaintance and lived at her house for several months. In December of the same year, Kitaev's next place of residence became the Smolensk region, where the most cold-blooded of his crimes would later be committed. Once there, he went to the police station and complained that he had been robbed. Kitaev showed his father's military identification, who at that time had a different last name. Based on this document, he was issued a new passport untainted by the stigma of criminal activity. After some time, Kitaev found housing in the Kordymovsky district and started working as a driver at the Kamensky State Farm's motor pool. He had a company car, a Zavod Imeni Likachova 133, at his disposal. At that time, he showed the best sides of his character, was a responsible employee, a pleasant colleague to talk to, and a reliable friend. However, people around him noticed that when intoxicated, Artur would turn into an extremely aggressive person, showing signs of misanthropy. Kitaev clearly felt the need for cultural self-improvement. In his free time, Kitaev wrote poems about the motherland, freedom and love for his mother. He was also generous with lyrical compliments to girls who found him quite popular. In addition, he became something like a local disc jockey, organizing lively discos and personally selecting the music. Now Artur could have started his life anew, choosing the path of truth and moral renewal, but once again he strayed from that path. The former criminal once again felt the urge to go against the law. The driving profession created all the conditions for committing unlawful acts. Kitaev drove around the region and, noticing attractive girls on the highway, offered them a ride. Then he would abruptly change the route and, without any difficulty, satisfy his dirty fantasies. Thus, in the Rudninsky district of Smolensk, a 17-year-old girl named Tamara died at his hands. Some time later, on the outskirts of the village of Prelesye, the mutilated body of one of Kitaev's young fellow travelers, 20-year-old Galina, was found. In total, from 1990 to 1992, the maniac committed 6 murders, taking the lives of only women. He was not original in his crimes and always acted according to the same pattern. He assaulted the passenger first in a regular way, then in a perverted way, and then strangled her. He left the dead bodies in the roadside bushes without concealing them. The belongings of those women whom Kitaev brutally assaulted and killed, he gave as gifts to the lucky ones who were delighted by his passionate poetic works. February 24, 1994. By the decision of the Smolensk Regional Court, Artur Kitaev was sentenced to death, which was replaced by life imprisonment because a moratorium on the death penalty had been introduced. The murderer was transferred to Correctional Colony No. 6, better known as Torbievsky Central. There, Kitaev gained a bad reputation, repeatedly violated the rules, and often gave the administration reasons for negative reports. It was during one of the conflicts within the prison walls that Kitaev, according to the findings of his lawyers and journalist Yelena Masyuk, suffered a serious spinal injury. The guards at the facility beat the former maniac, who was not known for his gentle nature, and with a blow from a baton injured his spinal cord. As a result, Kitaev's physical condition noticeably deteriorated. He began to have problems with coordination and could now only move with the help of crutches. However, he officially stated that he had no complaints against anyone after this incident, explaining this by saying he was under strong pressure from the colony staff. Thus, life behind bars for the maniac was both burdensome on one hand and monotonous on the other. But in July 2019, justice was finally served for Kitaev. However, it was not the traumatized relatives of the victims who brought this into his life, but rather someone who was almost as much of a scoundrel as he was. The 29th citizen of Tajikistan, Dust Murat Ilyosov, Kitaev's cellmate, couldn't find common ground with the Smolensk barbarian. It should be noted that Ilyosov himself was not known for having an angelic temperament. He ended up behind bars after being accused of taking the lives of 4 people and attempting to take the life of a 5th. Kitaev caused him dislike on a mental level, and they often had arguments. The confrontation reached its peak on September 13, 2019. That day, Ilyosov, following his habit, started pacing back and forth in the cell. This irritated Kitaev. Unable to tolerate such restlessness, he sharply, using foul language, pointed out his cellmate's outrageous behavior. Dustmarod didn't like this harsh criticism, so he attacked his accuser, delivering 33 blows with his hands and feet to vital areas of the body. At the hospital, they tried to help the prisoner, but it was in vain. On September 29th, Kitaev died from complications caused by the severe injuries he had sustained. Later, at the court hearing, he received an additional 14 years in prison on top of his life sentence for this decision. Ilyasov was never at a loss for words. He explained the attack by saying it was due to Kitaev's constant remarks and reproaches. The victim in this case was recognized as Arthur's younger brother Konstantin. However, he did not appear in court and only gave written testimony, which he had previously provided during the investigation. In his testimony, Konstantin stated that he did not maintain any relationship with his brother following his arrest. Thus ended the life of Artur Kitaev, the last sexual maniac of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. The investigators familiar with the circumstances of this criminal case called Oleg Kuznetsov the most prolific ripper of the decade. In less than 3 months, the 23-year-old resident of Balashikha near Moscow committed 9 murders, aggravated by sadism and abuse of the raped girls. The total number of Kuznetsov's victims remains unknown. 5. Oleg Kuznetsov. He claims to have raped 500 women. In other statements, he reports 18 murders, gives the years, recalls details of the victim's clothing, the time of the attacks, addresses, names, and other details. These facts were only partially confirmed during the investigation, although, according to the detectives, the real number of victims of the Balashikha Ripper must indeed be very high. Reports of being forced into sexual intercourse, especially in small towns and villages, are rarely made. Victims try to hide their misfortune from neighbors, co-workers, and relatives. They prefer to forget and escape from the terrible and humiliating memory. One must take the following fact into account. Kuznetsov had excellent looks. I'll talk about his physical attributes later. He easily got acquainted with girls he liked and could make a good impression. A fair-haired, masculine, athletic-looking guy with a white-toothed smile and a clear gaze immediately won people's trust. And only when he was alone with his intended victim did he turn into a cruel and lustful beast. What he did to the bodies of the unfortunate girls is impossible for a normal person to even imagine. However, the question of his sanity was resolved positively. The Serbsky Institute experts found no mental abnormalities in the maniac. Thus, the court's death sentence surprised no one. According to the doctors, it's not a mental illness, but rather a monstrous, unbelievable selfishness. It is this quality that explains not only the motivation behind many of his wild actions, but also his belief in his own unique masculine virtues. From Kuznetsov's testimony.
I told her straight what I wanted and promised to let her go.
After we had sex, she told me straight to my face that she would turn me into the police. That's when I completely lost control. I proposed a half-hour walk, promising to escort her home afterwards. I don't remember the girl's name, but I liked her, and when we walked out into the field I started kissing her. She didn't object. I got aroused and put my hands lower. She told me not to do that and started to push me away. That made me furious. I dragged her to the forest and, without taking off all our clothes because it was cold, I assaulted her in the usual way. I stabbed her in the back and chest with a knife. I don't remember if I gouged out her eyes that time. As for his physical condition, he did not complain about his health. He was a member of the youth biathlon team in Spartak, knew hand-to-hand combat techniques from the army, could stand up for himself against the older soldiers, claimed that he never gave in to the whims of the elders and always responded blow for blow. This appears to be accurate. He served in the 2nd Company near Kiev and was involved in a fight in the barracks. Kuznetsov's nose was broken, but he wasn't discouraged. To a real man, scars like that only add character. He remembered his first killing in every detail. Back then, using Kuznetsov's own terminology, that's when it first hit him. The day before, he had argued with his woman and was in a bad mood. He took 2 bottles of red wine, planning to really relax, and then an opportunity came up. On the highway, he saw a girl hitchhiking. At that time, Kuznetsov was working as a truck driver at a company near Moscow. She asked for a ride home. During the drive, Kuznetsov offered her a drink, which she readily accepted after minimal convincing. They drove the car into a small grove not far from the village of Kupavna. They settled in the cab and the wine took effect quickly. According to Kuznetsov, she initiated the sexual advances herself and they made love all night. He describes in detail the time he spent with the victim, although he can't recall her name or appearance. The only understandable detail that remained in his memory. The girl was wearing tight pants. By morning she started to feel sleepy. They slept for about an hour in the truck cabin. And when he woke up and wanted to say goodbye to his night companion, something unexpected happened. Instead of saying goodbye, the girl, according to Kuznetsov, she did it willingly, suddenly demanded money. "Come on, 400 rubles," she said. "I'm a prostitute." And she added that she doesn't meet with anyone for free. Kuznetsov refused to pay. Then the girl, not realizing the consequences of her words, threatened, "It's up to you. If you don't give me the money, I'll turn you into the cops." These words had an immediate effect on Kuznetsov. Furious, he pulled the girl out of the booth and led her to the birch tree. The victim hardly resisted. She was a bit drunk. He tied her hands behind the tree trunk, stepped back and struck her twice, once between the legs and once in the head. The girl lost consciousness. He took out a crowbar and struck her head several times with all his strength. Later, her lifeless body, hanging from the tree with her arms twisted behind her back, was discovered by passers-by. The death toll had begun. After the killing in Kupavna, he stayed quiet for a while. But one evening in Balashika, at a bus stop in Skizo, the maniac meets an old friend who once treated him disrespectfully and openly kissed other guys. Kuznetsov greeted her as he recognized her, but she ignored him and walked by. From Kuznetsov's story, I asked what her behavior meant, why she was ignoring me. She tried to run away, but I caught up with her and took a pocket knife out of my jacket pocket. I didn't want to stab her just to scare her, but somehow she knocked the knife out of my hand and I never found it afterward. Then I dragged her away from the road and explained that I had treated her like a human being, that I hadn't forced her into sex. And since she treated me like dirt, it means I'll punish her. After having sex, she didn't resist. I made her kneel and had intercourse with her from behind. It lasted only about 2 minutes. Basically, I didn't want her, I just punished her this way. When she got up, I said this would be lesson number 1. Then I hit her a couple of times in the stomach and face, saying this was lesson number 2. She begged me to release her, promising not to involve the police. I trusted her word and let her go. The very next day, the police start looking for the maniac. He suspects who gave them the information. The girl still had Kuznetsov's home phone number from a long time ago. A local police officer comes to his house. On a friend's advice, he hides. First, he stays with an acquaintance in Balashika, and after he is almost caught by the police, Kuznetsov goes to Kiev. There, since his army days, he calls them absent without leave in his testimony. He has some old connections. He has quite a few female friends there. However, in the capital of Ukraine, he didn't visit his old addresses, preferring new experiences and fresh adventures. In Kiev, he meets Alla N right on the bus. From the very first day, they develop a very good relationship and they even apply for a marriage license. But gradually, his new girlfriend starts to irritate him, he loses control of himself and frequent arguments occur. As Kuznetsov testifies, he would snap after seeing Alla off to work and go out seeking something to do. The result was 4 ruined lives. The victims were not just raped and killed, they were tortured with particular cruelty. The maniac cut their eyelids with a knife, gouged out their eyes and inserted sticks into their genitals to destroy traces of semen. Escaping was rare. Kuznetsov doesn't mention the usual assaults, as those were just ordinary episodes. After another crime, when he robbed the victim, took the boots off the dead girl, pulled a wallet out of her purse and tore a cross from her neck. He returns to Moscow. Before he was arrested by the police, he still had time to walk around as much as he wanted. When he snapped, he would go out into the street. His favorite place to meet girls he liked was the area around Izmailovsky Park. He makes explicit propositions, gets agitated if refused, rapes, and, fearing being exposed again, takes lives. One of the sadist's victims had a stick forced into her vagina to a depth of 62 centimeters. It was after this crime that he, in his own words, went out to get some fresh air. The last of the 10 murders proven by the investigation were committed by Kuznetsov near the Izmailovo shopping and hotel complex. The acquaintance starts traditionally. "Do you have a cigarette, please?" The friendly girls offered him a cigarette, but unfortunately, they were too playful. Nothing else was needed. Of course, he really wanted it, especially with the younger of the friends. They went for a walk in the park. The man took out a knife as he walked behind two people with his preferred target slightly ahead of him. An unnecessary witness, he stabbed the girl in the neck twice, but either the knife slipped or the girl managed to react in time. Bleeding and screaming, she ran away. Now the only one left in the maniac's power was Tarade, whom he was going to for some fresh air. He dragged the girl deeper into the forest. Twice she tried to break free, and both times she immediately got a punch in the stomach with force. After that, the broken victim didn't try to escape. Kuznetsov ordered her to undress. She took off her clothes, lay down on them, didn't scream, didn't cry. After doing what he wanted as a man, he took out a knife and stabbed her twice. The girl, who was given strength by despair, tried to break free, but the biathlete with a sports rank of course didn't give her a chance. The victim, like others, pleaded for mercy and vowed not to report to the police, but he didn't believe her. Finally, after making sure the girl showed no signs of life, he gouged out her eyes and left. He was detained early in the morning on March 26, 1992. The criminal investigation officers managed to find the address where Kuznetsov was staying with his sympathetic girlfriend. When he got on the tram, the detectives approached him. "Your ticket?" Kuznetsov immediately realized who was in front of him and did not resist. They found the knife in his bag that was used to kill the last victim and discovered other evidence. And later, in a remote corner of Izmailovsky Park, he himself showed the body of the girl buried in the snow. This crime only became known after Kuznetsov confessed in his testimony. The maniac claimed that he wanted to meet girls in a good way, hoping it would help him calm down. But it happened that they contradicted him, and he lost his composure and control over his actions. After his arrest, Kuznetsov confessed to all the deprivations of life and abuses, including those that were unknown to law enforcement, and pointed out the locations where the crimes were committed. During the search, women's belongings were found at the maniac's place. On December 1, 1993, the court sentenced Oleg Kuznetsov to death by shooting, but he was saved by the moratorium on the death penalty. The execution was replaced with life imprisonment. He served his sentence in the high-security colony correctional colony, Odin, Mordovian zone in the village of Sosnovka, Zubovo-Polyansky district, Republic of Mordovia. While imprisoned, he didn't admit guilt. No one visited or sent packages, and he barely communicated with cellmates. He died on August 4, 2000 from heart failure. Kuznetsov's death only became widely known in 2019. Tanya Tkacheva, a 6-year-old girl, came with her mother and brother to visit relatives in Moscow. At the end of June, with the other children away at summer houses and pioneer camps, Tanya invented her own games. What she liked most was riding the elevator, up, down, up. On a summer morning right after breakfast, she went out for a walk and never came back. Late in the evening, after searching all the courtyards and entrances, her mother reported her daughter's disappearance to the police. Another 2 days passed in oppressive anticipation and faint hope that everything would work out, that the little village girl had simply gotten lost in the unfamiliar city, and that she would be found any moment now, that even if something bad had happened, it could surely be fixed. On the third day, near the house, in an abandoned shed, a child's head and right leg were found. That was all that was left of Tanya. And the next day, in a disused settling tank located 30 meters from the shed, the rest of the body parts were found. The forensic autopsy established that Tanya Tkacheva died within 2 to 4 hours after eating and 2 to 3 days before she was found. This meant one thing: the girl was deprived of her life on June 22nd around noon. The remains looked strange, atypical for such cases. As the experts determined, the body had been washed with water. All the terrifying findings, uncovered and not wrapped in anything, indicated that the killer must be different from ordinary people. In the pocket of the murdered girl's dress, they found a watch without glass, a summer candy wrapper, and 1 kopeck. None of these items belonged to Tanya, and another clue for the investigation: scraps of newspapers on the remains. There were clearly visible bloodstains on the scraps. It wasn't too difficult to identify the names of the newspapers, Izvestia and Soviet Russia, and the dates they were published. And the clue was that at that time, Izvestia wasn't sold in the Shchukinskaya area, which meant the criminal was most likely a subscriber to that newspaper. The investigation also assumed that the criminal lived nearby, probably worked somewhere close as well, and possibly had a car and used a garage. And finally, the traditional theory was also considered that the criminal had previously been prosecuted for offenses against minors or suffered from mental disorders. At first, there were several hundred suspects, then the circle narrowed down to 47 people, then to 12, and finally, there were 5 men left, each of whom could have been the criminal. But none of these people were involved in Tanya's death, and the Don Juan theory itself was dismissed rather quickly. The investigation lasted for more than 6 months, says Friedrich Svetlov, until it became clear that the most interesting person was Lavrentiev, a withdrawn, secretive and unsociable man completely absorbed in himself. He married at 47 due to his mother's disapproval earlier. We were able to obtain information that Lavrentiev went out of town and engaged in bestiality. We also knew that he wouldn't just walk past a girl calmly, he would definitely look back. He resided in the same building as Aunt Tanya Tkacheva. From a young age, he felt different from others. He confesses to the psychiatrist his fear of women and inability to approach them. It bothered me. I couldn't allow myself what a single man usually allows himself. My mother objected. She lived alone. My father had left a long time ago. She was over 50. She sensed that I was suffering and allowed certain sexual acts with her. She said, "Come here. It's hard for you to live unmarried. Let me make it easier for you." She told him everything would work out after he got married, but things weren't really working out for him. This explained his shyness and indecisiveness in relationships with women. As a religious man, Lavrentiev found it unacceptable to have an extramarital affair, fearing God's punishment. The psychiatrist kept asking, "Why do you say in vain? Is that so?" "I knew it was forbidden," Lavrentiev replied, offended. I had different ideas about this matter. His relationship with his mother lasted nearly 12 years before he became attracted to girls, whom he didn't fear like he did women. According to Lavrentiev, dealing with weak girls was easier. The psychiatrist asked how his attraction to girls manifested. There was no direct or sexual arousal, Lavrentiev reasoned. But there was desire and pleasure. I would touch my genitals, rub them, and rarely insert my middle finger. All of this was such a pleasure, but there was no normal sexual intercourse. He would watch for a long time as little girls played while squatting, imagining scenes in his mind, and one day, while walking by the pond, he made up his mind. He waited for a preschool girl in the bushes and said, "Let's go." I asked her to show me, likely promising her something in return. First one girl, then another. The first one ran away, but the other said okay and took off her panties. Then she let out a little scream. There was blood, and that concluded it, said Lavrentiev. I usually feel a kind of pleasure, like when you look at a beautiful picture. He would wait for girls outside the movie theater, buy 2 tickets at the box office, and invite them to watch a film. He almost always guessed correctly which one would agree, would go with him, and wouldn't tell anyone. He usually chose the second to last morning screening, and sitting in the dark, half-empty theater showed Dasha what to do like this. The very first teenage girl he picked out from a group of her peers near the cinema cynically agreed, saying, "Give me a ruble and with Soska too." After the screening, Lavrentiev would take the girl to a separate bench, cover her knees with a coat he wore even in warm weather, and get his pleasure. Some young adventure seekers would invite him to the movies themselves, already knowing from their friends about the way to earn a ruble. Lavrentiev realized that his inclination was criminal, but he couldn't overcome himself. He knew nothing would work out with women, there was nothing he could do, and the only way out of the vicious circle seemed to him to be marriage. I had high hopes that I would get married and stop being inhuman, he said during the interrogation. His fiancée was the first adult woman he dared to kiss, but on their wedding night, he was unsuccessful. It happened again the next night. His wife remained a virgin. Only the 3rd attempt was successful. But a full sexual act is not necessary for conception, and in 1953 he had a daughter who died during childbirth due to a severe pathology. Unfortunately, the hope for a normal married life did not come true. Lavrentiev did not feel like a full partner in intimate relations. Even a gentle remark or wish from his wife made during intimacy meant another failure for Lavrentiev as a husband. He consulted specialists about his impotence, underwent a course of treatment, but all to no avail. and he started looking at girls again. On that cursed day, he woke up with a severe headache. It was Saturday, a short work day. Lavrentiev usually had lunch at work, but this time he decided to stop by home. He noticed an unfamiliar girl in the entryway. Opening the door, he called out to her. Tanya saw many toys by the window at the Lavrentiev's unoccupied country house. The number of toys is not specified, the girl exclaimed. Meanwhile, after taking off his coat, he watched Tanya's movements, and she, feeling a strange uneasiness, started to leave. She bent down for some reason, hesitating for a moment, and Lavrentiev, not taking his eyes off her, saw the child's bare leg. He felt aroused because the sight of a child's leg always affected him that way. "Did you want to have sexual intercourse with her?" they asked him during the interrogation. "Yes, I did," he answered. "But when I start to get nervous, all my arousal disappears. I dragged her to the bathroom, she started to scream. At that moment, I wasn't fully aware of my actions. I had lost all desire. I don't even know why I started putting her in the bathtub. She was struggling and didn't want to get in. Why was she struggling? I don't know, maybe she was scared or something. I covered her mouth with one hand, and with the other hand I held her between the legs. When she calmed down, I took my hands away and saw that she wasn't moving. She was dead. I had unconsciously covered her mouth with my hand while holding her tightly. There was a small amount of blood in the bathtub. My fingers were covered in blood. I was shocked by the death. The bathroom door was open. There was a deadly silence in the apartment. The light was on. Lavrentiev looked at the girl again. She was lying in the same position. He turned on the water and went to the kitchen for a knife. He took the one he usually used to cut bread and returned to his victim again. He dismembered the dead body, washed the knife, took out a cardboard box and put the severed head and leg into it. He carried the nearly uncovered box out of the building entrance. It wasn't late at night, Lavrentiev said during questioning. I was walking during daylight hours. Apparently the box became heavier and I got tired. There was a temporary structure nearby, a pumping station without a door, without anything. There was a pit there, water was glistening. I lowered the body into this pit and didn't cover it with anything. He returned home and put what was left in the bathtub into a box. He acted as if in a half-dream. On one hand he remembered some details, but on the other his mind refused to accept what he had done. A corpse needed to be disposed of, but Lavrentiev seemed unaware of why it was there. The next day he went to his wife and son at their country house. He looked sick and exhausted. He didn't say a word about what had happened. He could only confide in the Almighty and begged for forgiveness. Only a monster could do such a thing, Lavrentiev repeated when he, along with many others, was summoned to the police about the murder of the girl. Later, when he ran into familiar detectives on the street, he would reach out his hand in greeting until one day that hand was left hanging in the air. He didn't know that the police sieve, having carefully sifted out everything unnecessary, had left only him at the bottom. The investigator issued a warrant for arrest, Friedrich Svetlov said, and we started thinking about where to detain the criminal. Taking him out of the building handcuffed was dangerous. He wouldn't have survived the trip to Petrovka. We detained him in a deserted place when he was walking to work after lunch. He reached out his hand to me and I said sharply, "I don't shake hands with murderers." A few days later, Lavrentiev gave a detailed testimony. He fully admitted his guilt in Tanya's death, although he said he didn't mean to kill her. Friedrich Svetlov recorded all his interrogations on a tape recorder, although at that time statements obtained in this way could not be included in the case. The day of the trial was approaching. Lavrentiev wrote a long letter to his wife, the essence of which was that he was not guilty of the child's death, but was forced to take on someone else's grave sin. The lawyer did not deliver the letter to its intended recipient, but read it out in court, immediately questioning the experience and qualifications of the expert. The court remanded the case for further investigation. From his cell, Lavrentiev wrote a complaint to the prosecutor's office, claiming that illegal investigative methods had been used against him and that there had been threats to harm his son. The case reached the Minister of Internal Affairs, and tape recordings of the interrogations without threats helped at that point. And a repeated commission examination confirmed the conclusions made by the expert. It was with the knife seized from Lavrentiev that Tanya's body was dismembered.